One thing I like to do whenever I give a talk is find out who was in the room with me. So I'm going to ask you all, because I'm up here standing with you staring at me, to stand up so I can stare at you and tell me who you are. What you do if you're a student, a professor, whatever it is that you do. And then maybe one thing you're hoping to get out of this conversation. That would be really great. We can just start right here front.
Hi, Pam Shukai, Career Services here for OSU Mansfield. And in terms of the learning experience, to be honest with you, I've been so busy, I'm just here to learn new information or new ideas, increase my awareness of resources. Brooke Henwood, licensed social worker as well. I currently work at the Child Development Center, and it is here to look at what options and opportunities and resources.
Hi, I'm Scott Sheck. I am an early childhood education master's student right now, and I'm just looking for a broader view, like holistic view of education and what is
It's going to be okay. You don't even have to use this. Can you sit there and just tell me what you do? What do you do? I don't care what your name is. What do you do? Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Everett is in middle childhood education, and I always like to find maybe new strategies to help students, other members of the LGBT community, to make them feel better in classrooms or just in social settings.
Hi, I'm Erin Farley, middle childhood education, and I'm kind of like Scott, just want to try to find out a little bit more about like this with education and diversity. I'm Cassandra Jones, and I'm a really chocolate major, and everything is.
I'm April, master's in middle childhood. We had a diversity course last quarter, so it's been a fun motivation.
Erin Hughes, I'm a middle childhood master's student here, so I'm just kind of here to talk a little bit more about it.
Jessica, I'm a middle childhood master's student. Just to, get more information.
I'm Sherry Dawson, and I'm in middle childhood, and it's always good to hear from somebody else. Rachel Bowen, I'm not in education. I'm in the early education department. I teach political science, and I'm here to lend my presence and support and hear what you guys.
I'm a Christian Spud. I'm a early childhood and social studies professor, so these are all for me. I'm here really just to expand my knowledge, and also I'm a big advocate and not complicated, I guess.
Linda J. Level, I'm a professor in early childhood at North Central, Sister Anne's here, and interested in more information. Very important to have an anti-bias approach when working with young children, and so anything I can learn that can help my students understand the subject as well as myself. Sure. And help them.
I'm just here to teach sociology, and I teach a lot of intro students, and we do various solutions, they rise and bond, and state bond, a freshman, something like that. So yeah, I guess something new, something new, and what we're saying.
And I'm David Chilton. I'm associate dean of the campus, so I'm interested in everything. You tell me I'm interested, but I am interested. I'm also on the music faculty.
Okay. You want to share everything?
I'm Jeff Offer with Ohio State University Police. Obviously, the words of violence, diversity. Hope we get anything out of this that I can because of the situations I get put in.
Thank you. I would thank you for being here. I think too often our law enforcement professionals aren't educated a lot about the issues, and they don't seem to care. And so I really appreciate you being here.
Doesn't mean I'm learning anything.
But you're here. You are here. And then our camera will let me just. Okay. All right. We have a lot of educators here, which is great. I had a lot of jobs. I used to work at a Fidelity, Ohio, and we used to do presentations called Safe Schools, or Safe Places, Safe Space, Safe Places, I think. But we talked to people who work with youth and children about how to basically just work and be inclusive and working with young people. A lot of them would be like, well, I don't work with any kids who, are lesbian, gay, or trans, and it was like, oh, yes, you do. Trust me, especially if they're kids, they might not even know that. So I'm glad that you're here because you feel hopeful for the future. I have 2 young children, which I will probably relate to later on or throughout because I've learned the most about life through my children. But I have a 7-year-old, soon to be 8 in about 2 weeks. A daughter in the 2nd grade, and she broke her arm at 12:05 on January 1st this year. So we spent our first 5.5 hours in the new year in the emergency room. And I have a son, Jeremiah, who's in 4th grade, and he'll be 9 in May. So I'm here on this middle child. I'm like, bless you for wanting to teach him. So, okay. I'm going to start off with an exercise. I'm going to ask all of you just to close your eyes and listen, and then we'll kind of talk about it. Imagine it's early in the morning and the alarm goes off. You roll over and give your partner a kiss and try to pretend to go back to sleep, but she gets out of bed and you both get ready for your day. As you walk out the door, you notice that there is another egg that was thrown at your house during the night. You don't know if it was a random or purposeful. Either way, you don't have time to clean it off now, and you'll have to wait until later. You go to the gym. It's the only women's gym in Portland or Mansfield, but you know you need to quit because the other day when you asked about partner benefits, the woman at the front desk snorted with laughter. She said that it wouldn't be fair to the straight women, and besides, the lesbians would all lie and bring in people who weren't their partners. Then you stop by your partner's office to bring her a surprise cup of coffee on the way to work, and you notice that although she's a picture of your friends and your dog on her bulletin board, she still does not have a picture of you. She does not want to be put off by having a picture of her same-sex partner. You leave after whispering I love you so that no one else can hear. When you're at work, you hear the words fag and gay used by the young people at work. You always interrupt their behavior, but you notice that not all other staff people do. A coworker during lunch tells a homophobic joke, and you get up to leave. Near the end of the workday, you are hanging out with a bunch of female coworkers, and everyone is talking about sex. You add to the conversation by bringing up an example of a boyfriend you had years ago, instead of the multiple examples of ex-girlfriends you could have brought up. Afterwards, you feel ashamed and call yourself a chicken. You take your dog to the park after work, and one boy dog is helping another boy dog, and the other dog owners make funny remarks about the dogs being gay. They quiet down when you realize you were there because they have seen you there with your partner before. Everyone then looks away from you in awkward silence. You and your partner are having dinner with your mom that night, who is mostly supportive. When the subject of homophobia comes up, she says, "But you guys don't experience that, do you? I mean, here we are in the restaurant, we tour together, and everything is okay." I read that because we're going to be talking about homophobia, and I think it's important to first acknowledge that homophobia is not always overt and blatant. It's not always getting bashed over the head, it's not always hearing, derogatory terms, it's not always being discriminated against, which those things do happen, and those things are very important and very real. But I think it's very important to at least acknowledge that this happens in everyday life. And I know personally, in my experience, I do live in Columbus, and Columbus is, I think, considered like one of the best gay locations in the country. But they fail to say that that's just a piece of Columbus. It's not the entire city. It's like downtown Columbus. For those of you who are familiar, it's short north, some of the university areas. When you get out to the suburbs or some of the more urban areas, it completely changes. And I'm even aware that with my partner, we'll be downtown or whatever, and I feel completely safe. I go to a different part of town, and we sometimes question if we should show affection. Or at my kid's school, is it okay to put my arm around her in the assembly? Is it okay for my kids to say this to their mom? And so those are things that are always running through my mind. And maybe it's not a real threat, maybe it's perceived on my behalf. But that's just an example of homophobia and how real it is. And so even though we don't see it, it's still out there. Any thoughts about what I just read? Anybody have any similar experiences or know of anyone like that? relates to, them experiencing hate and expressing violence. A friend of mine and I were talking about this, and he determined the more fear that we feel, the more violent we become. And that's in anything in life. If you think about it, our flight or fight senses come up whenever we feel threatened in any way. We're ready to fight. We think of the term violence only, I think, in lashing out physically, but you can be verbally violent. You can have violent emotions, violent thoughts. And so basically it's where the cost is, where the risk is. That's what brings up that response inside of us. So just so we're on the same page, I'm going to define some of these words. Homophobia, obviously, is a range of negative attitudes and feelings towards homosexuality and people who are identified as or perceived as being homosexual. It's observed in critical and hostile behaviors such as discrimination and violence. There's a thought that the homophobia and discrimination that people feel is not because of who they are, but because of society's attitudes. And so, unless it's not about me, it's about them. It's about people's other issues and how society sets things up. And that can be as clear as watching TV. How many same-sex families do we see on TV? I know there's Modern Family. I've never seen the show, but I'm aware of it. I don't know if there's other TV shows that are on same-sex families. Did you think of one?
I don't know the same sex, but they get a true blood.
Okay, they do approach it. Think about our commercials that we see. The kids waking up in the morning and they have waffles or coffee. You see a mom and a dad, or just a mom, which is another issue with women, which is another topic. But women in the kitchen. But society is always telling us how we're supposed to feel. And so there's an example of that. It's called heteronormativity, but that we don't ever see ourselves reflected. Again, to be on the same page, hate is a dislike intensely or passionately. It's feeling extreme aversion for, extreme hostility toward, to loathe, to despise. Other words or synonyms are abhor, detest, abominate. Abhor means to express a deep-rooted horror and a sense of repugnance or complete rejection. To detest implies intense dislike and vehement antipathy. And to abominate is to express a strong feeling of disgust and repulsion towards something thought of as unworthy, unlucky, or the like. And lastly, in terms of violence, it's the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, a community or group, that results in the high likelihood of death, psychological harm, or deprivation. The definition, though, which I think is interesting, is it's about the intentionality with the committing of the act, irrespective of the outcome. And so people who are expressing violence, they're typically they're not thinking of the outcome per se, like they don't care if the consequence intended or unintended. It's just committing the act, like a release or something. Some additional meanings of violence, and I read these to you because I feel like they just really brought the word home. Swift and intense force, the violence of a storm, rough or injurious physical force, action or treatment, an unjust or unwarranted exertion of force or power, as against rights or laws, or to take over something by violence. A rough or immoderate vehemence as a feeling or language. So what I wanted to talk about is how homophobia and hatred and violence are tied with one another, the impact. And what I came up with is that they're all linked. They're like the link of oppression and discrimination. Yes, you can have one without the other. They can't exist independently. But you can't just get rid of one if you want to get rid of all three. It's about the education. It's about reaching out to people. It's about understanding reasons why people do feel some hatred. And so what I want to ask you in your experience, and I'm not saying that you have felt this way, but others you know who do say things about people who are LGBT identified, what are some of the reasons that they hate or don't like them? What are some things that you've heard? Religion. That's a big one. Yes?
They're not conforming to feminine or masculine.
Oh yeah, gender expression. Other things?
There's a certain gross factor for a lot of people. And it's sort of,
Yeah.
so
why are you even thinking of that? Why are our minds going there? It's got religion, the gender expression, the grossness of it all. Other things that we hear.
Biology. This is not natural.
Right. Yeah, that's actually all the things that I've written down that I hear the most. I think religion plays a big role in it. Even for those who aren't, I should say, I guess faithfully practicing their religion, they still will fall back on that. As a reason why it's not okay. And it still creates hate, which I always find interesting. I think the gender expression piece is very interesting. When we talk about discrimination, I think about like transphobia, you know, not like people who are transgender, trans-identified, non-gender conforming. It is about what they look like. And in general, I think a lot of homophobia and discrimination is about how we present ourselves. I think if, you know, you've heard of like lipstick lesbians and femme lesbians, if a woman can look like a woman is supposed to look, she's less likely to be discriminated against than if she has, or veers away from that in any capacity, regardless of her sexual orientation. If she doesn't look a certain way, people think she's something else. And so the gender expression, which we all do every day, it's all a performance. Every day we get dressed, we think about how we want to present ourselves. Everyone does it. And the gross factor I always find interesting. Like I said, why are people even thinking? It has nothing to do with you, but it being gross. I was reading an article and the author was saying, has anybody ever watched sausage being made or chicken McNuggets? It's pretty gross, but we eat them. Or if you can think of the process of a lot of things that we eat, it's pretty gross, but we still consume those things and don't think twice about it. Never eat nuggets again. And so I think what's important to look at, though, is we've got those surfacey reasons, but what are the real reasons why people experience hate? So we've got, you know, the surface, oh, it's bad, God says it's bad, it's gross, I don't understand it, why do you look that way? But I think what it really comes down to is an us versus them, kind of a pride thing. I think I'm better than you. It's about, you know, when you think about rights for people. So for here across the state of Ohio, it's still legal to be fired for your sexual orientation or gender identity, real or perceived. Someone thinks you're part of the LGBT community, you can be fired if they assume that. In Columbus, state workers are protected. Bowling Green people are protected. There's a couple other small pockets of the state where people are protected there, but statewide there are currently no protections. And that law, which I think is interesting, when I worked in Equality, Ohio at this time, we got it passed through the House in 2009, but then it got to the Senate and it just stalled. They wouldn't even touch it, they wouldn't even look at it. But I remember having to sit in the hearing room and hear the opponents talk about why this law, you know, against discrimination should not be passed. And what it really came down to is, well, of course, the fear and all those other reasons, but they felt like it would be taking something away from them. You know, if you protect gay people, that means that I can't have my own beliefs and be who I am. Or we hear about the marriage debate, the marriage equality. You know, it's a attack on traditional marriage, and so it's again people trying to be protected. That goes back to that the cost, the benefit, the loss thing. People begin to get protected and they think they're going to lose something. Another thing is about the loss of control, and again, and these are my politics, I don't expect you all to believe in them, but you know, we know who runs the world, runs our country, runs our cities, our states, and it's typically men, typically white men, typically men who are upper class, or millionaires, very wealthy. So for them to begin to allow other people to have part of their power, that signifies a loss of control for them. Because when you are a legislator, when you are, you know, rich, when you're all of those things, you do have a sense of control over what's happening. You control the politics and the social structures. And so allowing people to get married who are of the same sex, oh my God, what could happen? So again, it's that fear factor, and it's coming up again, and something bad could happen, be out of control. I've heard things, well, what's next? People are going to want to marry their animals. Ridiculous. So again, trying to be in control, a threat to one's worldview, take the dominant culture, dominant worldview, anything against that is another threat. And then my favorite is the fear that someone might actually themselves be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. the internalized homophobia. And I often wonder for people who are very strongly against the community if that is what's going on, because people do hear things growing up and it's negative, it's bad, it's all these things, and so I don't want to be that way myself, and so I'm going to project on somebody else. And I personally had that experience. My years in undergrad, I was part of a church. Community was the evangelical, Pentecostal, people running around the church, speaking in tongues. Women had to wear dresses, no makeup, no earrings. You were submissive to your husband and all the men in the church. Very antiquated views. And my pastor would always use the word faggot from the pulpit or dying in a very negative way. And I was a part of that. That was my community for some time, even though I knew who I was on the inside, because that was so ingrained in me not to like these people, not to approve of their quote-unquote lifestyles. I participated in that homophobia. And so, being the extremely liberal-minded, progressive person I am, I know people who aren't that as such are doing the same thing. And so that happens all the time. I think other ways that we can look at homophobia in terms of whether homophobia kills, or is it what creates it that kills. And when I talk about death and killing, I don't just mean the physical. I think it kills our souls and our spirits, things on the inside. If we look at homophobia as a form of a weapon, there are many ways that it kills. There's suicides every year in the LGBT community, particularly among youth. Are you all familiar with the rash of suicides since 2010 by a lot of youth? And it's still happening all the time. They just don't all make the news. But think about it, as a child enters this time of trying to figure out who they are, they have no one to affirm who they are. And especially if it's their peers, and then there's not adults who are also doing that, it's going to be hard. And so what other options do they feel like they have? LGBT-identified youth are 7 times more likely to attempt to complete suicide than their straight peers. And this changes even more within the transgender community. 50% of trans-identified people attempt suicide. I believe about 17% of those are actually completions. And that's, like I said, transphobia. I don't think we talk about transphobia a lot, but it's very similar to the homophobia. I think the unfortunate thing is even within the LGBT community there is transphobia. And people say, why is the T even on with our letters, or why are they part of our community? How is this all related? And so that hatred is definitely in there. But I think when we talk about homophobia and we talk about stopping it or changing it, it makes me wonder, can we ever get rid of it? I don't think we can. I think we can decrease it. I think we can decrease its impacts, but just as other people can't change my mind, I know that I can't just change everybody else's mind as much as I'd like to. I think too often, when there are hate crimes and things of that nature, you often hear about them being male on male, and so maybe a straight male is, attacking another gay male or something that they perceive of that. So we go back to the fear or the homophobia internalize itself, and we have that intense hatred, then we see that violence. What are some other ways that, if we can think about that, we see homophobia, hatred, and violence played out? And I talked about the physical abuse. The passage I read, of course, talked about people throwing eggs on their doors, which just happened in Westerville, Ohio. It's a suburb about 20 minutes outside of Columbus, probably about a month ago. There were eggs, and somebody had written on their, I think it was their garage door, basically, get out of here, move, fag, or we hate you. It was something like that, but it was very wrong to do. And it's very blatant. I don't think we see that either. So I want to hear from you all. What are some ways that you've witnessed homophobia or experienced it yourself? Yes?
I'm coming from my Scotland, and there's a big gay community in Manchester. But on the outskirts of that, there was a bar. I can't remember what it was, a gay bar. And one evening, once everybody went up to the place was sort of like torched.
punishment for something that extreme to knock people's teeth out. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like that was just like almost, oh, here, have a free education in school, almost a reward for their,
Right.
I don't know. I think that seems to be a big form of violence and hate and homophobia in our public schools. There's not a lot of effective ways to deal with that.
Right. And I think you're right. I know the school that my kids go to is Columbus City Schools, and they have, in their non-discrimination policy, sexual orientation, gender identity enumerated in there. But no, not all school districts have that. And people say, and in fact, Equality Ohio, again, I just got an email from them about their safe schools bill to try to get through legislation. The big deal is enumerating and having sexual orientation, gender identity included. And people say, what's the big deal? Bullying is wrong. Yes, we all know that bullying is wrong across the table. When you begin to enumerate and identify this type of bullying is wrong, this type is, I think it speaks very loudly to a form of acceptance of those parts of the community. And so that is an importance of it. And so, this school, had they had that, maybe something different could have been done. And I don't, obviously, know all the backstory to it, but I think we see that happening all the time. And kids don't get the punishment, and nobody stands up for them. They're not talking about it in school. In California, they're including LGBT history in their courses, like the history of oppression, and people are freaked out about that. And I know, in working on the non-discrimination bill, that was something else we wanted included. There was that to be included with like women's rights and the civil rights movement and the other marginalized communities to talk about that because it's important. And I believe as adults we've got power to make changes, to do things, but I feel like our real power is in with the children, with the young people, because they're the ones that are growing up and they're the ones that are going to change the attitudes that we have. With my children, we're very fortunate at the school we go to. Everybody's extremely accepting and affirming. There's lots of families there that have same-sex parents. I don't know how we happened upon that, but there's multiple families. And to the extent where my daughter sees someone who's pregnant, she'll say, how'd that baby get in there? Because we've explained, how Nick's mom, there is no dad, and she doesn't have a husband, and how he was born, obviously in age-appropriate ways, but she's so, inclusive and open in her thinking, she knows that there's other ways for children to be made. There's other ways that families can be constructed. And I think that we have to do a better job working with youth to start that conversation. Studies show, in fact, that it's not even the kids who have the issues mostly. It's the parents, it's the caregivers, the adults. And then they're the ones that are passing that along to their children and youth. How many of you in here are married? So a question, are you married to somebody of the opposite sex? Okay, well, what caused your homosexuality? I'll ask you.
I don't know.
When did you first decide that you were heterosexual? For those of you that are. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the boyfriend in first grade once.
Okay. Was that your decision? You know what, I like heterosexual. Do you think it stemmed from a neurotic fear of others of your own sex? If you never slept with a person of the opposite sex, how do you know that you would prefer that? Who have you told about being heterosexual? When did you come out? And what I want to know is, why do you insist on making a public spectacle of your heterosexuality? Why did you raise your hand and tell me that you were married? Other thoughts are that you might just need a good gay lover and then you'll be cured from being heterosexual. And then, why are heterosexuals so promiscuous? Having all these partners, they get married, they get divorced. Here's a good one. Despite all the support marriage receives from society, the divorce rate is spiraling. So, why are there so few stable relationships among heterosexuals? Why do you guys think that is? And a great majority of child molesters are heterosexual. Do you think it's safe to have straight people teaching their children? Considering the menace of overpopulation, how can the human race survive if everyone was heterosexual? It's your fault that we're overpopulated at this point. And then, why do you make it a point of attributing heterosexuality to famous people? Is it just to justify your own heterosexuality, to make yourself feel better for who you are? These are questions that gay people get asked all the time. Whether it's verbally spoken or implied, this is the general sense of our society. And so again, going back to homophobia and tearing that down and challenging those attitudes, here's an example of one great way to help that, is to not ask those questions. And I believe when people are hating, and this might be naive of me, is that, you know, it is a lack of understanding, and it is a portion of fear. And so I think education is another important thing. I think being here tonight is a very good first step in understanding things and having education, but then going out and speaking to others about that as well. But standing up when you hear someone say a joke that is not appropriate in general, but you know, if somebody's saying something that's a homophobic joke, it's okay not to laugh or to challenge that. Yes.
You mentioned something about, you know, right now, it's political, being treated, or about partners and stuff like that. And one thing I noticed is that it's perfectly okay for these guys to make a platform and consider, you know, banning the appearance and stuff like that. And if you know, apply that to a group, there would never be sanction. You know what I mean? If somebody says, you know, the word black, for example, was written saying form, they had to sort of backtrack from that. Oh, I didn't say black, I didn't say black. Well, they didn't say a lot. Very homophobic statements, and it just washes over people and nobody seems to mind. So we're not at that level of sensitivity yet.
I agree. Have you all seen the statement that Rick Santorum said about children with gay parents are better off with a parent in prison? Has anybody seen this article? Google it, look it up, but basically he's saying that children with gay parents, I mean, it's a horrible life they're going to live. They'd be better off if their parents were in prison, they were in foster care, or were parented. And what gets me is that this is a presidential candidate who has this open platform to say these things. And yes, you know, people in the community are outraged and saying this is wrong, and that's great, but nobody else in the mainstream is saying anything. They're not touching it, they're ignoring it, drives me like it's no big deal. But if somebody were to say that black people would be better off in prison, but people do say that, but if they were to say that platform, now that I think about it, what'd you say? Oh yeah, they have to apologize for it, and you know, or if somebody were to talk about women negatively. And so clearly we're not there yet in terms of you know, LGBT community and how people can talk about us and say things. You know, and my favorite is always about the marriage debate, marriage equality, and you know, destroying traditional marriage and whatnot. And my thing is always, when you stand up against divorce, whether you stand up against marriage equality, I will listen to you. When you make divorce illegal, I will listen to you. I won't like it, I won't, but I'll respect you a little bit more. Because we have no-fault divorce, people are getting married and divorced left and right. We know about Kim Kardashian, being married for 72 days, I believe. Sinead O'Connor was married, was it 3 weeks maybe, recently? I don't know why I know this, but people do this, you know, it's nothing to do. It's nothing to fly to Vegas and get married. And that's great, and that's a great privilege, but they can also get divorced that easy, and that's also a privilege. And so when you talk about traditional marriage, I don't know that gay people are the ones destroying it. I don't know that anybody's destroying it. I don't know that there's traditional marriage at all. I think that's a whole other topic in terms of the conversation. Are there any questions about or other thoughts on homosexuality? I actually don't even like that term, but been playing with the homophobia. And the reason I don't like that term is I think it's very clinical, and I think it pathologizes things a little bit when you know someone's a homosexual. Well, that's what people use when they're talking negatively and with hate-filled speech. And so I personally don't even like to use that word. I always cringe when I see it written places. At my job, I work in a crisis center, and we have people coming in all the time. And in our assessment area, where we talk about family and social history, a lot of people will write like, client is a homosexual and has been with multiple partners. And I'm like, that just sets the stage to perpetuate stereotypes, and I know their intent is different, but again, those little things that we can do to challenge homophobia, to challenge the hatred, to challenge the ignorance and people's fear, and I think we will then begin to see a decrease in violence. Any questions or other thoughts?
If you don't use that name, what is the proper political title to use?
Great question. I personally, and I know there's for lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. You know, I guess transgender is like better than homosexuality, but you know, say an LGBT community or LGBT identified, LGBT person, like those are all very inclusive ways to say things. You know, or if you know someone identifies as a lesbian, it's okay to call them a lesbian. It's okay to say that someone's gay or bisexual. Like those aren't bad words. And I think that sometimes we shy away from using those, particularly in professional settings. I don't always know why, but any of those things are more than appropriate to use to describe a person. In terms of culture, I know in a lot of communities of color, the phrase same gender loving is also preferred. When I worked in HIV, we used the phrase men who have sex with men when talking about outreach instead of just, our gay men, because a lot of people don't identify, a lot of men don't identify as gay, particularly in communities of color. And so we have a hard time doing outreach when we say it's for gay men. Well, someone doesn't identify as gay, they're not going to come for services, they're not going to listen to prevention messages because that's not them. But if you say men who have sex with men, that's a whole different tagline, a whole different thing that they're hearing, and they know that that's who they are. And so language obviously is very important. Other questions? Thoughts? Yes?
Would you mind touching a bit more on racism, homophobia as it relates to whether it's different ethnicities or certain groups of individuals?
Absolutely. In terms of people of color, and I get asked this a lot, and there's this assumption that race is about racism and homophobia, and how are they related, or is there more homophobia within communities of color? And I think the short answer is probably yes, maybe in a different way. I think a lot of us are generalized. But when you look, particularly the Black community, which I feel most qualified to talk about, religion also plays a big role in that. A lot of people in Black communities grow up with church as the center of who they are. Whether they go or not, it's part of the culture, it's part of our history, and so that plays a large role in that. And so people do grow up and they do have the homophobic thoughts. They do think it's wrong. They do have the internalized. They do have risky sex because they're not out and they don't identify as gay and no one's speaking their language. Another thing, and this is something we deal with in Columbus, I know it's not specific or unique, is that people of color are not represented in our political landscape in the LGBT community. There's probably about a handful of us who are the same ones who come to everything and have the same conversations. And so the group that Demetria mentioned in my bio, Unity of Columbus, we started this group for one, to find the people of color, to say, where are you? We know you live here in Columbus. But then to also to challenge the mainstream organizations of why don't you have people of color in your leadership? And so it's kind of a dual thing. But what we had a community conversations in 2010, about 66 people. We talked about what's happening. Why is there a gap in representation? And what we heard from people of color specifically is this isn't important to me, the political stuff. Yes, I have a same-sex partner, but I'm just living my life. That's not the core of my identity. Or we hear the word queer pretty often, which is somewhat popular, I guess, age 35 and under, 30 and under. But people of color are saying, I don't call myself queer. That's a white thing. And so when those words get used, that doesn't speak to me. Why would I be there? And so in terms of representation, it's not, I don't say not an important part of their identity, but it's not at the top of their list. And also with people of color, there's typically a choice to be made. Am I identifying as this person of color, or is my LGBT identity going to be here? Like when I walk into a room, what are people going to see first? When I walk into a room, I am always more aware of being a Black woman than anything else in my life, than any other label that I have or any other role that I have. That's the one thing that I bring in that everybody can see. And so it's fighting through that discrimination and racism just for that piece right there, let alone, whenever they ask questions or I used to determine to disclose anything about my life, they learn more about me. And so that's another piece of, who am I? How do I determine that? And when you look at youth of color too, suicide attempts are higher. There's a higher rate of school dropouts for LGBT youth of color. There's, in terms of HIV infections with men, gay men in particular, those go up. And a lot of that is because of the shame and the internalized hatred that they have for themselves because they can't be out. They don't have anybody affirming them. They do feel like they have to choose between their identities. And so all these layers, and that person who they are gets pushed down so far, they're not taking care of them. And so, look at in the room, who's here? I don't see any, outside of Demetrius, obvious people of color in here, and if I'm wrong, please tell me. But I don't see that. And so I think it's important to ask why aren't they here? Why isn't this conversation important to communities of color? Because God knows we've got violence and there's hate and there's homophobia there. But this portion of the community is not coming to the table. And so that's some of the work that we're doing on Columbus is to try to work with the nation organizations to make sure their outreach is very specific and inclusive. To make sure in leadership roles that you've got people of color. Because people will come to an organization, they see folks that look like them. And we're also working with some of the Black churches locally. It started out with HIV/AIDS prevention, which was a hard thing to even get them to agree to do. They felt like they were promoting sex, and they're like, no, just want people to be safe. But that goes back to that religion and that fear thing, and that's very strong within a lot of Black communities. Within Latino communities, the Catholic religion is mostly prevalent, and same kinds of things. Very much on the machismo, macho side for the men, and being gay as a man is looked down on completely. So again, people aren't out, or they're getting teased or belittled or beat up for that. We don't have a lot of research information about Asian Pacific Islanders or Native Americans within our community, at least in Columbus. I know they're there, and I know I see people in the community a lot, but there's a lot of work still to be done, I think, in those communities in terms of this conversation and bringing up this topic, because it is pretty taboo. Any questions? Thoughts? What about, for those of you who are educated in their classrooms, do these kinds of things ever come up? Or people, yes?
What would you do if you were in a school district teaching that you knew it wasn't acceptable? You had a kid that you knew was a key marker or something to you, and you wanted to be an ethics. That school district wasn't acceptable. Could you get fired?
Of course you could. Ohio's an at-will state. So yeah, that's the short answer. Yeah, of course you could. If that school completely hated gay people and wanted to,
So what did you do to a kid?
It's a great question. Probably nothing that would help them. Chances are that kid would only come out to you and maybe one or two friends if they're lucky. But otherwise they would come to school every day. And this is just assuming that they're not the stereotypical gay kid. We all have the image of what the stereotypes look like. They're not that kid and they can blend in. They'll be fine on the surface because nobody would know anything. No, and I think if you did tell somebody else, it would definitely be a confidentiality issue and look at the reasons why you're telling somebody else and things like that. But what a unique opportunity to raise your voice and to stand up or to challenge the school to say, we've got this kid here and we're not accepting and we're not welcoming and we need to do something different.
So I know that happened a lot with the school district prior to this. I don't want to end up there, but if I did.
So it did happen, a kid came out. What was the end result of all that?
He just got picked on a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know where he's at now, but I remember he got picked on a lot.
Yeah.
That students needed, I was teachers for me at all.
Sure. Yes.
Are you a believer in the It's Better campaign?
I never want to squash anyone's efforts to make the world better. That being said, criticism of it is you say it gets better, but how do they make it better? We all know, like, for most of us, life does get better. Adolescence typically sucks for most people. But at the end of the tunnel, as we get older, things just get easier and get better. But this campaign is not giving people the tools to make it better. So what does that mean? You're ninth grade, you go to school every day and get your lunch stolen and kicked in the head every single day. Exactly. Your parents don't know you're gay, so you can't even tell them what's happening. You know the principal doesn't care because they called you a faggot openly. What are you supposed to do? Just hope and pray for graduation? No. Right, and what can a teacher do? And, there's GSA, the Gay Straight Alliances. Not all schools have them, but it's a great thing to start out if you are a teacher or if you have that role. Or partnering with local communities that you know work with the LGBT population or our LGBT organizations. I think that'd be a great way actually to reach out to them and explain to them what's going on. I know we get at Equality Ohio, we got calls often from school districts across the state that were in rural places like Lima, saying, what can I do? There's no support here. And we'd be able to give them a list of, well, there's some support here. We know this group happening here. It was very underground. We felt very weird to be doing that in 2000s. But it's an opportunity to stand up. And yeah, that responsibility would fall on that educator or that adult to do that. What do you think about the It Gets Better campaign? Are you part of it since I put it down?
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I think it's truthful. I think things get better the older you get in some ways. But 4 years of high school, if not even including middle school, that's a long time to go through bullying and depression and anxiety every day. It kind of sounds like you're saying you can be, the best you can do is to either choose to be kind of like a silent help to a student, or to basically, which I think is true, to go ahead and make a decision, stand up and just put your dog on the line if you really are that passionate about it.
Right.
What else can you do?
Exactly. And there are small things we can do. So for me, I've done a lot of the activist work, I've done the protesting, I've done all those things. I think they're great. They're for a certain time in my life. I'm a little older now, got kids to feed, can't afford to lose my job. So I found a different way to make a difference. And through Trans Ohio, which is a statewide organization for the trans community, I run 2 support groups. One is for trans-identified or gender nonconforming youth ages 5 to 11, and then for ages 12 to 17. And I'll tell you, the pushback I got from our local LGBT organizations to hold group in their location it's unbelievable. In fact, we meet at a library for my little kids because none of the local organizations will let us meet there. And these are LGBT centers or, groups, whatever you want to call it. So we talk about within the community, and so in doing that, it's telling these kids it gets better, but it's also showing them. So if my little ones who are 5, they're so adorable, they're meeting other kids just like them. And we're normalizing who they are. Indirectly, even. We don't talk about people being trans. I don't know if I've ever even used that word in group. It's a play group. They color, they make jewelry, they make friends, they exchange numbers, they hug, and they go home. And that's what kids do. They want to play. And they just like each other. But they're able to come. I have actually 2 kids right now who were born assigned male and they're kind of toying with being female and wearing girls' clothes. They have somebody else that's doing the same thing. They don't even talk about it, but they like each other and they're friends and they know that somebody else looks like them. And so that's a great way to build that esteem and to affirm them even at the ages of 4 or 5. Because yes, kids do have gender identity even as early as the age of 3. But then with my older kids, 12 to 17, and we meet at a Kaleidoscope as a youth center, so they were okay with that. But it's the same kind of conversations to help them to normalize it, talking about strategies for bullying, what can you do if somebody jumps on you or punches you, or if you hear negative things in the hallway, helping them identify who is a safe adult within their school or community they can talk to, trying to, and then we also work with law enforcement too, so they have that sensitivity. So it definitely is a community effort. I think saying, it gets better is great, and it makes people feel better at the time of crisis. When that crisis is over, we stop hearing about the suicides and the hate crimes. What else do we have? Demetrius, where are we on time? You don't know? Okay, thank you. Huh? We're good, okay. Other questions or thoughts, situations?
This is my group that are inarticulate, but something I think about a lot of the marriage issue is, when I was coming up, gay rights, people talk a lot about gay liberation, right? And it is this kind of, it's liberating, and so everybody's going to do their own crazy thing, and the people that they want to be, and that is what activism and expression is all about. And now it seems like, especially with the focus on marriage, there's a lot more about gay people are going to have a traditional life as they're supposed to have. And I just wonder what you think about that sort of narrowing of what that identity can be.
I think everybody should have equal access to all things. Borderline socialist, I'm okay with that. I think everybody should have equal access. I think we're getting into trouble within the community of, and I hope I heard your question right, of saying we're just like everybody else. There's nothing special about us, there's nothing different about us. We just want to do what you're doing and live your great life. While that argument I can see is valid in a courtroom and with legislation, I personally, I think identity politics are very important, and I think holding on to who you are and saying, no, I'm not just like you, and that needs to be okay. And you still need to learn to accept me because I accept you. I think that we're getting away from that. But there are those in the community who do just want to have this heteronormative life with their partner or spouse and their kids and go to work and come home and not touch anything outside of their bubble. I think that's okay too. I do think as a community of a whole, we are narrowing down who we are, and we are assimilating, There's this quote, it's by this poet named Lani Ka'ahumanu. She's Hawaiian, and she says assimilation is a lie, it's spiritual erasure. And I think when we get to assimilate and we forget who we are, or forget our history, or choose not to acknowledge it, we do erase a whole part of who we are. And I think that's the direction that it looks like we're going. I understand it, I understand the tactic, and I understand why that argument's being used, but it does kind of freak me out a little bit. Is that what you're asking? And I think when we talk about pride too, and it gets better and the affirming, when we start to erase those things, you've got a whole set of people growing up and they're not going to have language anymore. So we went to there not being language because no one talked about it, to there being tons of language with the gay liberation and the Stonewall and the rebellion and all these things. So now we're getting to where we don't want to talk about it because we want everyone to think that we're just like them. And I don't know how powerful that is and what that's going to end up looking like. There's the Ohio Women's Festival. It was the Ohio Lesbian Festival. It's been going on for over 20 years in this rural part of Columbus. And I was on the committee for it last year, and there's a big conversation of changing the name to the Ohio Women's Festival. I wanted to reach a broader audience, I wanted to know it wasn't just for lesbians. And I tell you, there was this uproar of these older lesbians, ages, 50 and up, who thought, no, we worked really hard to say we were lesbians at one point. This is who we are. It talks about politics, everything, and we're not changing it just to make other women feel comfortable. And so I think we do see some pushback. I think it's small, but definitely as a whole, we're beginning to assimilate quite a bit. Other questions? Other thoughts? Other comments? One thing I like to do with groups is this thing called Changing Tomorrow. And I have these cards, and I know it's like a feel-good thing, and some of you are going to hate it, But I'd like people to talk about, what can you do differently to make a difference, to challenge homophobia, to challenge hate, to decrease violence. You want green? But so we can think about, how can we challenge homophobia? How can we individually in our daily lives, what are things that we do that perpetuate it? And so, again, in working with youth, with kids, if you're talking to a kid, instead of saying, or anyone, instead of saying you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, it's as simple as saying, is there anybody special in your life? And believe it or not, those little things are going to make a difference into the larger scope of homophobia. Because it's showing acceptance, it's showing tolerance, it's helping remove stereotypes. So I'd like for you to write down, you have two sides. On the first side, I want you to write down something you feel like you can do to change tomorrow in terms of homophobia, violence, and hate. What are some ideas you have for yourself personally, or ways that you can get involved? Ways you can get involved, or ways you can do personally, whether it's standing up to a joke, or calling that cousin who came out but nobody really liked, something like that. On the other side, I want you to write something about you. I typically, when I do this, it's within the context of racism and homophobia conversation, but I think as we move toward a world of greater acceptance, it's about understanding each other. And so think about a stereotype that people have about you and your gender or your ethnic group or something, and tell me something different. So, would be an example. I feel like often people think I'm an angry black woman. So my thing would be like, I am an angry black woman, but that's okay. Something that kind of statement. So, let's create some understanding amongst people. What is something you hear about white women? Think about some of those stereotypes, and then right on the other side, something to challenge that. And so what I'm going to please ask you is, I would like to hear what you're going to do to change tomorrow. What is your thing that you feel like you can do in the context of this conversation?
Sorry, can you repeat what this word about yourselves?
Something that challenges the stereotype someone has about you. You or your culture or your gender. Yeah, it could just be like your culture, or your teacher group or whatever. So if we could start in the front, what is one thing that you feel like you could do as an individual to make a difference regarding homophobia?
trying to, usually like I do say something when they tell a joke or they make a comment that's not appropriate or something like that. So it's finding ways to speak up and not put them on the defensive, just try to educate them. I mean, not to say that I'm more educated than them, but
Just speak up.
yes.
Great.
I just put a perfect language terminology, using it, but also calling out that I used to use it. Like, I had experiencing just today, not on this topic, but that same thing at church with someone who said something which totally outlined about an ethnic group. And just, really?
Yeah.
You said that, you know, but you should.
It's like shaming people for doing that. If enough of us do it, it'll stop.
I will be addressing the stereotype you can't equate religion and be gay at the same time. And that you can't be more vocal about that. You can't, like, I got a pastor, he's totally against it whatsoever, but just being more vocal about that and being more vocal about who I am as a person. When people do try to shout at that, I hate it.
And, you know, thankfully there are faith communities and churches that are open and affirming and accepting. I know we've got a good handful of them. I think that's an important thing. I think sometimes we beat up on the church quite a bit with this topic, but there definitely are some. I can skip you. Okay, next.
I just said to be more honest about who I am to other people, and you deserve, applause, or to be so honest. Like, it's one thing to be honest and say it like this, but I'm sure you speak to a lot of different groups, and I think that's very courageous of you. I wish I could be more like that before.
You can, just do it.
I said that basically, I think just like promoting an attitude of acceptance around people that you're knowing around every day can really say a lot, and can encourage them to have positive attitudes about things as well. And simple, but I think it actually do a lot. I talked about promoting acceptance in early childhood classroom, and using literature to help do that. Because with younger children, literature is a great gateway into the real world, so it's a good way to introduce it without, a way to kind of get around the parents who are against you, talking about the issues, you can kind of still talk about it by using literature.
There's this book called 10,000 Dresses, and it's one of my favorites, but it's this little boy, but basically every night he dreams about 10,000 different dresses. And in the morning he goes to his mom and says, Mom, I have to try out this dress. I want this dress. And she says, don't be silly, boys don't wear dresses. And the kid walks away. Bailey. Next night, same thing, goes to the dad. That says the same thing. You're a boy, silly, you can't wear dresses. Same thing to the brother next day, and the brother kind of punches him, and then, you're supposed to be a boy. And at the end of the story, he meets this girl who's sewing on her porch. She's just walking in. She has like all these dress patterns, and she's like, I really don't have any more ideas. And Bailey's like, I have 10,000 ideas. And so Bailey and the neighbor start making all these different dress patterns, and it's just really cute sort of acceptance. And throughout the book, though, of course the parents refer to Bailey as he, but the narrator does not. It's just Bailey. So it's just a really cute book, and it's not overt, it's not in your face. But I know some of the little ones I work with will be like, oh, he's just like me, I like dresses too. So it's a really great to use.
I just like to advocate for students in high school when they're by themselves.
I said, advocating for students in my classroom, being ally for them, simply listening to communities and
Basically, severance and stuff like that, just because, I just feel like I should stand up for no matter what we're getting bullied about, just because I've been bullied, I don't know how long, my life in school. So I don't care, I stand up for any student, just because you've got to like person for a whole lot. What you believe, it's your personal belief, that's a good way to be.
I said
But in as educators, you have such a unique opportunity, like I said before, to be in front of kids, and even just little tweaks of language, you know, husband or wife, you know, partner, use the word partner instead of husband or wife, or significant other in conversations, or if you're given examples of things, try to find an author from different communities, or, you know, if you're,
Well, like Mother's Day.
yes, yes. Yeah, my daughter had the best kindergarten teacher. She let her make 2 Mother's Day cards. I mean, in fact, she suggested that we want to make that for Michelle, my partner. She said yes. And so, yeah, being open to that at the kid first, of course you can do that. Or to the kid who don't have a dad. And one more story real quick. With my son, with my daughter on a field trip, and this little boy, Nick, he and his brother, the one with the lesbian mom, and loves firefighter things, and he had his gear on, and I said, is your daddy a fireman? And the teacher's like, no. And the boy goes, I don't have a dad. And the firefighter out in the face, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know your dad had passed away. And he goes, he didn't die, I just don't have a dad. And then the kid moved on, you know? Because, you know, he's 7, you know, so a little more vocal. So, but just being mindful of those kinds of conversations. Oh, we're going this way. Did you? We're going to go back.
I was just speaking out, particularly in the classroom, and said, I find it to be a very strange balance because I teach about politics. I feel like I have to let students come to their own conclusions and learn to voice their own views. And so I think I may sometimes care too much on letting them voice some views that maybe but and I think that's just something I need to take out a lot more. How to deal with that.
I wrote down emphasizing that meaning is okay, and challenging incorrect ignorance of the text. This one being students.
I was just thinking of the challenge that I had in that. And when I was working this past term with some of my students in a diversity practicum seminar, I still had students trying to put out that they absolutely had no bias or prejudice. Right. You know, there's just not, I just can't seem to reach, and so getting more ideas, activities and things that can help me reach inside and have a better understanding. I was able to catch a particular student on one little thing, because she was talking about marriage and stuff like that. And somebody asked her about her husband, and the little kids asked her about her husband. I said, see, that's a stereotype, because she was older woman, and I'm happy with people married. And she was like, but it was just a teeny little crack to help her understand, you know, how it can come out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, examining privilege, and we all have biases and prejudices. Every one of us does. We all have privilege of some sort too. I think we need to acknowledge our privilege is a very important place to start.
Yeah.
I'm on several mailing lists with Columbus stands for multicultural affairs office. And very often when I get the mailings, I don't bother to look at it because I'm too busy and I'll get a couple hundred mailings a day. And after tonight, I'm looking to share images. Get the TV button, I'm looking to share any more images. I used to when I first got on all those lists.
Uh-huh.
And I gradually got away from it. Partly because recently we got removed from a lot of those. But I'm going to redouble my efforts.
Did you write something?
I did. Basically, I just wrote to continue to speak out and do so without hesitation. I think sometimes, particularly in a conversation, talking not just about this topic, but about different things. You know, you want to allow them an opportunity to have open discussion without, you know, feeling like they can't be themselves. But at the same time, you know, you feel like you don't correct it, somebody else probably won't. So at some moments, it's always an hesitation. Should I say something? If I say something, do they think I'm going to, you know, this person who I'm so politically correct,
are so PC in this society. Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And then I'd love to keep your cards. I like to keep a stack of these things. So if you're okay with that, I would appreciate it if you would take them. That's fine as well. I just have a quote. I want to read that we finish. Before that, are there any questions or thoughts about anything? If you want to talk individually, that's fine too. This is from the book called Woman Hating by Erin, radical feminist, died in 1995, very radical feminist. But this book actually is kind of similar to this topic, but it's more about with women and ways that people hate women and how our society doesn't appreciate them. But there's this quote, actually from a woman named Julian Beck, from the book The Life of Theater. And it says, "We are a feelingless people. If we could really feel, the pain would be so great that we would stop all the suffering. If we could feel that one person every second dies of starvation, and as this is happening, this writing, this reading, someone is dying of starvation, we would stop. If we could really feel it in the bowels, the groin, in the throat, and the breast, we would go into the street and stop the war, stop slavery, stop the prisons, stop the killings, stop destruction. And I might learn about this. When we feel, we will feel the emergency. When we feel the emergency, we will act. When we act, we will change the world." Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a good night.